Hi, everybody, and welcome to this PM Forum webinar. Today is a really interesting topic that is something that's important to many of us and should personally and should be important to us all. Everybody on this webinar today is a passionate advocate for increased inclusion, equality and diversity, both in professional and personal circumstances. And we're here today to talk about some of the impacts of the pandemic on the ED&I agenda. You may recall we had a similar discussion last year in July where we talked about the impact of the death of George Floyd and diversity and inclusion in professional services. We're now going to look at the impact of the pandemic in particular. By way of brief introduction, I'm Charlotte Green. I'm Head of Clients and Markets at Gowling WLG. I've been in the industry for longer than I care to remember, and I'm joined by an excellent panel. If I can firstly go to Dionne.
Hello, I'm Dionne. I'm a Business Development Manager at Amoo, Kingston Smith. In addition, I work with Countercol Network, a charity dedicated to supporting Black women during their working life experiences. And also I author my own blog, Words from a Black Woman, where I talk about social issues, including racism, inequity and inequality, well-being, amongst quite a lot of other things.
Thank you. Shall we now go to Nicky?
Hi, I'm Nicky, Acuna, Ocana, and I'm the Managing Director of Ambition UK. And we specialise in placing business services candidates into professional services firms.
Thank you. And David.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. David Pearson. I'm the Interim Head of Diversity, Inclusion and Corporate Responsibility at Gowling WLG. So I'm one of Charlotte's colleagues. I'm a member of the LGBT plus community. Apart from focusing on diversity and inclusion as my professional day job, in my spare time, I'm a patron of Freedom to Donate and a trustee of ELOP, an LGBT mental health and wellbeing charity.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've got a great panel for you today, as you can see. So just to set the scene quickly. As I say, the objective is to lift the lid on how the pandemic has changed both the debate and the actions around equality, inclusion and diversity for underrepresented communities in the professional services sector. And some of the, I think, interesting statistics that we've seen coming out of the pandemic include the fact that the employment rate for people from minority ethnic groups slumped 5.3% in the year to September 2020, compared to a 0.2% decrease in the number of white employees. Similarly, young people have been almost 3 times as likely to be unemployed than older workers. A survey by the Institute of Fiscal Studies showed that mothers were 23% more likely than fathers to become unemployed during the pandemic. And then those lacking resources such as space, help and support have struggled to juggle work and caring responsibilities. A City of London survey found that respondents from lower socioeconomic backgrounds take an average for 25% longer to experience a promotion compared with those from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, as defined by parental occupation. The progression gap increases to 32% when considering those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who also identify as Black. So we've got some really, I suppose, some negative impacts of the pandemic and things that we should all be aware of. There have been some positives, such as the fact that so many employees have experienced financial and resource pressures have brought to light these existing inequalities, and organisations are much more aware of these issues. So they've had weekly chats, regular online team meetings, which have created a more inclusive environment. And many feel that the pandemic has started to level the playing fields in some respects, at least. For example, with people working remotely, employers have been able to recruit more diversely, particularly in terms of geographical location, people wanting to work flexibly or remotely or with reduced hours. Many businesses are also revisiting diversity and inclusion strategies that they had begun before the pandemic, and taking this one step further. So focusing on inclusion first, diversity. So looking at their existing employee base and what they can actually do to help them. In the Grant Thornton's Women in Business research, 69% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed that new working practices driven by COVID-19 would benefit women's long-term career trajectories. So arguably, it's not been all bad, but I'd like to turn to the panel now. I'd like to ask you all, what changes do you think we've seen as a consequence of the pandemic for underrepresented groups, for better or for worse? Nicky, do you want to start?
Yes, I think it's been really interesting seeing how divisive at the start of the pandemic working from home was. We have a lot of people that work with us that are younger, and they tend to be in environments where they may be sharing homes and having to share workspaces with friends, but also with siblings as well. So it was the whole crossover with people trying to get laptops, juggling with other children working from home. Women, I thought, was very challenging because they were being dragged into this 1950s model working, whereby they were trying to do their own day-to-day jobs, also trying to homeschool and trying to keep their home environments stable and operational. I think it's been really challenging when you look at the amount of people who at the start of the pandemic had never worked from home because they hadn't been given either an opportunity, or in a lot of environments it wasn't even allowed to contemplate that somebody could work effectively from home. So it really it was a tale of two halves, really. People that had an opportunity and experience and had the ability to work from home, even though it was hard for them, they seemed to pick it up pretty quickly. And then the other half found it incredibly hard work. And, there were lots of lumps and bumps along the way whilst we were trying to get people set up and operational.
Thank you. Dionne?
Well, I mean, we've seen an explosion of committees, whether it be ED&I, D&I, inclusion, kind of whatever people wanted to call it. And I think that's been a great start because it's provided a platform and an opportunity to hear various perspectives where that wasn't always the case before. And through these committees, there's definitely been an openness to address some of the issues that are affecting minority groups. For me personally, racism was always a taboo topic. And it's been one of those things that if you bring up in the past, covert or overt racism, there was always an air of uncomfortability and at times some judgment. So it's been transformative to actually see that these conversations are being invited. So hearing others acknowledging some of the destructive nature of racism, it's made a real difference, because I know that when I've experienced some racism in the past, I felt quite alone and unable to talk about it so openly and so freely. The issues with George Floyd and football and racism in football, they were things that were traditionally seen as issues outside of the workplace. But I think it's becoming clearer and more apparent that whether it's people walking through your corridors or sitting on the other side of a Zoom call, people are deeply impacted by some of these issues that are happening, and it will affect their professional lives as well as their personal lives. So although we have seen some progress, there is also quite a lot of work to be done so that some of these really good and positive conversations that are happening turn into real and recognisable change that people can identify as being an effort that's been made from the organisation. The charity that I work with, Countercol Network, that I mentioned earlier, we are still seeing a steady stream of Black women coming to us for support, whether it be to help them through grievances or well-being. And I think that's indicative that, we're really right at the start of this journey. So complacency just isn't where we need to be at all. And I think companies also need to get a grips with the full breadth of EDI, which involves a lot of investment in time and resources, but also making sure that there is awareness that there is a big change management piece that sits alongside this, and that might manifest in something like unconscious bias training.
Absolutely, thank you. David, did you have something to say? You want to talk about mental health and the impact there, I think?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. So I think for me, I had a couple of conversations with colleagues that were an eye-opener, things that perhaps we would take for granted or not be aware of if we didn't have that connection with our colleagues to understand what they're going through. One example being a colleague from a neurodiverse background who said actually they felt quite threatened by people wearing masks in the office. They rely on being able to connect with people's faces to sort of understand the situation. And that's probably not something I would have ever thought of. And equally, a colleague with a hearing impairment who relies on lip reading to help supplement what they can hear. And of course, you can't lip read very easily when someone's wearing a mask in the office. So those are some sort of concrete examples. I think on the more negative side, there's the hidden pandemic, which became really apparent to me. You know, the impact on mental health. Many of our colleagues have they're lacking in human touch. They might live alone. And even the simple thing of being able to shake hands with someone or touch someone on the arm, or even just be close to someone. And there's those feelings of loneliness. There's the uncertainty that's come from lockdown, release, very hard to plan your life and plan your emotional life when there's a constant uncertainty there. And I think for most of our organizations, there are power structures that can get in the way of people having equitable access to flexible working arrangements, for example. So if you're a low status employee, and particularly potentially from a diverse background, it's very hard for you to speak up and say, well, why is someone more senior to me and someone more similar to my boss being given more flexibility around working arrangements than I'm getting? And that power comes in where if you're of low status within the organization, it's very hard to point that out. It takes a lot of courage and a lot of emotional labor to do that. But on the positive side, I think I've at least seen more willingness, I think, to connect across sectors and across firms. And there's quite a lot of initiatives. Dionne mentioned some of the work that's ongoing around racism, for example, and tackling racism. And one of the positives I've seen is what appears to be more willingness to connect outside your organization and to share experience, to learn from others and to work collaboratively on solutions.
So it's kind of a game of two halves, really. We started to push open that door, and then there's a long way to go, and it's a very, very nuanced conversation covering lots and lots of different touch points and personal circumstances, and if anything, perhaps the conversation has become more complicated than it had in the past, which probably needed to be done. Just sort of picking up upon some of the more psychological side of things then, and research from the Bridge Group on law firms back in 2018 indicated that employees from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often experience negative psychological effects of moving away from their own culture and heritage into the dominant cultures of, in this case, the legal profession, but I think we can say it kind of will spread across, it's probably, we're able to sort of extrapolate this across the whole of professional services. The impact being on these individuals that they feel part of neither culture. Do you think, panel, that people from diverse backgrounds have been able to be more authentically themselves in a remote working environment than they have been when they were in the office? Dionne, I think you had something to say on that.
Yeah, so I can touch on again, and that no problem at all. So when I was working at home during COVID, personally, I felt the need to counteract some of the negative stereotypes that almost come with being an ethnic minority. And this is quite a natural reaction. You want to always kind of put your best foot forward, and the things that you think might count against you, you try and eliminate. My home is tiny. I can't compete with some of the beautiful French doors I see behind so many of my colleagues. But actually, I recently read an article in the Harvard Business Review about code switching. And what code switching is, it involves individuals adjusting their speech, their appearance, and their behaviour in order to optimise the comfort of others in the hope of receiving fairer and equal treatment, which in itself is quite mind-blowing, to be honest. And the article also directly referenced at how common this is within many underrepresented groups. So The pandemic made it very difficult for you or anyone to try and code switch, because the reality is our colleagues they're in our home. So when you are code switching, and you're in the actual working environment, it's much easier. You can come in and you don't have to worry about kind of what's in your background. But the pandemic just took that completely away. So another point, and this is the last point I will mention from this article, was that across the board, Black workers actually do not believe that they can bring their authentic selves to work. And that is due to assimilation pressures. And the reality is some of these assimilation pressures are actually unspoken. There's like a standard that's been set that people almost feel that they have to adhere to. So I can use myself as an example. I have Afro hair. Before, I wouldn't imagine coming to work with my Afro hair, because one, you don't want to feel as though you're a spectacle, but also there is like a clear understanding that actually what is seen or deemed as a professional hairstyle might be straight hair. So people just automatically kind of put themselves in these boxes, and when you look around you, there is no other representation. So you do actually feel that you have to fit into that. So I just think that employees have a real duty of care to create an environment that encourages people to turn up as themselves. And, now I come into the office with jazzy headscarves. I've got so many headscarves, and then I've got my Afro hair out. And I think that I just felt that was something that didn't seem to be possible before the pandemic.
And that's a really important expression of somebody's individuality, and of course brings together their personal persona and their professional persona, which is excellent. Nicky, you had something to say, didn't you, on this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to Dionne's point that maybe pre-COVID people couldn't bring their authentic true selves to work, and actually that's one of the positives that's happened, that inviting people into your homes, you can use a screen and a filter as well now, which is great, which wasn't possible at the start, I don't think, but being able to be yourself has definitely been a learning curve through the pandemic, and people are more open to showing their true selves. I think that some firms have done some really good work around this as well, which has come from the bottom up, which is, if you look at BDO as an example, they started coffee conversations. So it was a way of getting some of the partners and the more senior managers to have some one-to-one time with people at all different levels in the organisation, and really start to share experiences and start to share how people were thinking and finding their working lives through the pandemic. And I think they were 20 or 30-minute short bursts of coffee and a chat over Zoom or over Teams. And that really helped drive their agenda forward as a firm. And I think I'm right in saying that they're still doing that now as well. And they've taken a lot of positivity from that. So even though there's been a lot of challenges, there have been some wins along the way. And this bringing yourself and your authentic self to your workplace is definitely one of them.
And of course, this is the workplaces where we often step outside our personal bubbles and see diversity in action. And it's a great opportunity for us all to kind of learn. And David, I think you had something to say in that vein as well.
Yeah, and actually picking up Dionne's point around hair, we at Gowling, we signed up to the Halo Hair Code, which I know many firms have done, because we recognise the importance to people of that part of their identity and their culture, and making it really clear that it's welcome in the workplace. So there's no doubt, can I come with my traditional hairstyle? Yes, you absolutely can, and you're welcome and you belong. And it's a simple thing, but actually I think it makes a lot of difference to the people for whom that is important. I think what I've observed happen is with Zoom calls and kind of the ability to express yourself and be authentic, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think, Dionne and Nicky have kind of mentioned some of perhaps the positive things. I'm aware for some people, perhaps trans people, I've had some feedback from them saying, actually Zoom can be quite challenging because depending how you present and what stage of your journey as a trans person you're at, it can be more or less difficult because of appearance, clothing, background, voice. All of these things become kind of thrown into relief, and you have to stop and think, how am I coming across? And that emotional energy then, you know, it takes away from perhaps the ability you have to feel connected and to feel you belong. But on the plus side, perhaps there are some benefits. I think of the awkward water cooler conversations that typically take place on a Monday, where for people, for example, if you're LGBT plus and you're not out at work, what did you do on the weekend? Oh, well, I went out. Oh, who did you go out with? Oh, well, with my partner. Okay. And you know, what did you do? Well, blah, blah, blah. And then you're into the pronoun game, right? And you're not using the pronouns of your partner because you don't want to disclose. So that person becomes a they rather than a he or she. And so that, the reason I think perhaps we avoid that a little bit is because, at least in my experience, people tend to be now spending more time on Zoom within their own core team and less time sort of mixing more generally. And a bit of that, you know, random social interaction is taken away. And where it does happen, though, it's confined within that team. And I think there's a potential risk there that we start to lose contact with the diversity of our organisations. If it just so happens that your team looks very similar to you, you're going to lose the perception that there is diversity in your organisation because, for example, you may not see people of a different skin colour very often on calls. And I've noticed that myself. You know, when I join calls, I'm very aware of the visual impact, but the fact that when I walk around the office, I tend to see random people I may not know at all, but I clock them and I go, okay, awesome, great to see you're there. And my view is that we kind of learn diversity when we interact in the workplace. And so if our interaction in the workplace is reduced or made less diverse, then in effect, one of our learning places for learning diversity does run the risk that we get kind of stuck in a bubble when we work remotely.
So this week, with everybody going back to the office, then this is a great opportunity to continue to really, really push hard on diversity, on allowing people to be their authentic self in and amongst their colleagues, and for everybody to see diversity in action. I should just say, actually, if you've got any questions, you're very welcome to pop them in the Q&A box, not the chat, I've been told. So please feel free to pitch them in, and we'll take a look at them and either leave them to the end or we'll add them in. Okay, but please do share your questions with us. We touched a little bit earlier on sort of awkward conversations, and I'd just like to turn to the panel and ask, starting with David, are firms helping their employees to have more of those traditionally awkward conversations, and are they actually starting to become less awkward and more in the sort of to be expected of the everyday conversations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Charlotte. And the one thing that occurred to me then that worries me a little bit is if the conversations are becoming less awkward because the people on one side of the conversation are becoming complacent and think that they've got it, then that's a worry, because maybe they're just not understanding that these conversations may continue to be awkward for a very, very long time, and they need to be signed up for that. Because I think the aim of an awkward conversation is not to make the person feeling awkward feel less awkward, actually. It's to address the issues and the barriers that the other person is experiencing. But having said that, I know that many organisations are taking steps to address this. They're sometimes called courageous conversations, aren't they? Which always, to me, sounds like you're about to bungee jump or something off the edge of a cliff. You need a bit of courage to do that. I know at Gowling, we instituted some Let's Talk About Race sessions, and picking up on what Dionne said about the murder of George Floyd, you know, that was a very much bottom-up initiative, but the firm fully supported to create a space where people could discuss race, how people could discuss the impact on them of those events. In a very safe space. And from that came, you know, really concrete actions like the development of a Black Lives Matter action plan. And so that series then led on to further conversations about topics like mental health. We had collaborative events where we brought together race and sexual orientation and had a really profound discussion with internal and external speakers about racism in the LGBT plus community and homophobia in the Black and ethnic minority community. So there's all sorts of opportunities there, I think, to extend those conversations. My gut instinct, and I could be wrong, and Dionne and Nicky, please correct me if you don't agree with this, but my sense is that at the organisational level, there are things happening, but there's still a lot of work to be done at the individual level. How skilled are our leaders and our managers at having awkward conversations?
Thank you very much, David. Dionne, Nicky, any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I do agree with David. I think that the communication piece is so important across every level. It's got to be top down and bottom up for these conversations to be happening. And I know that, talking from personal experience with Ambition throughout the pandemic, some people didn't have their cameras on Zoom calls or Teams calls. And the reason was, for one lady in particular, was that she was in her family home. She had lots of siblings that were being homeschooled, and she was doing some of her work in a very small enclosed space in her bedroom. So she didn't want people to see that. It made her feel really uncomfortable. So, after a couple of conversations, it was, why haven't you got your camera on? Because that's how you engage with people. And it is about that, reaching out to people. And, she shared why. And, that's really quite powerful for somebody to share something so personal. So you've got to have, the ability to build these strong communication networks with your team. And similarly, pulling up from one of David's points earlier about mental health, there was a member of my team that was getting increasingly withdrawn, and also feeling really uncomfortable in conversations with some of the other team members. And he was really struggling with his mental health. And, luckily, we managed to have a conversation on a one-to-one basis, him and I, and then we arranged to have a face-to-face meeting, which really helped. But it's about how can you build trust to enable people to feel that they can have these conversations without being judged, and without it impacting careers as well. And I think that's something, we talked about the water, David mentioned the water cooler moment. Lots of relationships happen in those very casual situations in an office, whether it's, you nip into the toilet and you bump into someone, or you're in the kitchen making a coffee. Now, all of that has been removed, and you have you don't have the ability for those small moments together. And that's how you build trust, and that's how you build relationships. So it's finding other ways for people to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dionne?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. I think there needs to be a clear precedent set right by the senior team, and they should be at the forefront of some of these awkward conversations, because it does make a difference. At Moore Kingston Smith, at the start of the pandemic, our managing partner updates changed from being over email to then being communicated over video. And this new kind of platform of internal communication, it gave the business an opportunity to widely address some of the issues that we've mentioned, whether it be George Floyd, whether it be the racism in football, as I mentioned earlier. And I think it's about having that openness. I think if you see the senior management team talking about these things, inviting these conversations, then you're more likely that people are going to feel more comfortable to share their own personal experiences and also how they may be feeling. And the reality is that's how you're going to start to build trust, as Nicky said. And usually what follows trust is honesty.
Indeed, and it's an ongoing conversation, isn't it? Just to keep that going, because you can lose that trust as easily as you gain it. We touched a little bit earlier on things like power structures, but do you think that power structures are changing now within organisations? And does that mean that change is being driven in a different way? Dionne?
Again, this is going to draw on some of the things that David just mentioned as well. Traditionally, we've been seeing change coming from the top down, whereas now we are seeing it from the bottom up. I think the reality is every leadership team, every business needs to create an environment that is conducive to change. And that's going to start with really little things such as, do you actually even have a committee in place to talk about inclusion? Are you aware of the demographic breakdown within your own organisation? And are your own people aware of what your goals are? And the reality is people are demanding change. And for those who may be slightly ahead in the journey and they may have a committee, what's next? What's your plan? Have you set KPIs? And I think without some of these foundational actions taking place, it's going to be really difficult to measure how people are demanding some of this change and also seeing if the organisation is living up to the expectations of their people. And this is where I would say, when you look at EDI, transparency is as equally as important as accountability.
Absolutely. David, do you agree with Dionne that it's a bottom-up change rather than the top-down?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, I even went so far as to think of it in my own mind as a sea change. Now, maybe I'm overstating that, but I definitely get the sense that the pandemic has created its shift in expectations. I think in some sense, there's a stronger sense of employees holding firms to account for what they've said they will do and for the changes they want to see. The old model, I think, was a little bit like, we all agree there's an issue we need to deal with around diversity and inclusion. Firm comes up with some initiatives, and to some degree, the employees then leave the firm to get on with it. That's the old model. The new model is a push from below, like we've said, bottom-up push for change, and then a real engagement from employees, staying connected throughout the process, wanting to see change, wanting to see evidence of what's happening, wanting communication around it, wanting to know the story behind it, and wanting more transparency. I think the idea that employees now trust organisations to just get on with it in a black box and sort of work some magic, it's not there now. It's much more, we want to see what's going on and why. That could be an outgrowth of online working. It may be the immediacy, as it were, being able to sort of connect online and see things there and then that has given people this sense. Maybe I'm overstating it a bit, but I definitely feel there's more of a bottom-up push, more of a demand for transparency and wanting to see measurable change in timescales that I think for many of us who are D&I practitioners are quite challenging, because a lot of this change is quite slow burn, isn't it? And yet our people are saying, where's the proof of the change?
Absolutely. And Nicky, talk about the proof of the change. How is that affecting perhaps people who are looking at either leaving or joining a new business? What, as a recruitment agent, what are you seeing?
We're seeing massive change now, and it's interesting when we talk about diversity and inclusion, and lots of firms have got wonderful diversity policies that they can share and are on the internet and their websites, and actually the inclusion piece isn't necessarily there. And because we are in a candidate short market, I'm sure everyone on the call today recognises that, then what employees will do is vote by walking. So if a firm isn't offering a proper policy, proper inclusivity and diversity, people will leave firms. And, we are finding more and more people coming to us saying, we've been told this was going to be the way of working. It's not the reality. And we're looking for other opportunities now. So people are going to vote with their feet. And actually, I think it's an opportunity to almost rip the rule book up a little bit for some of the firms that have been very traditional. And, to David and Dionne's points, we are looking at this bottom-up approach, which will really help move the agenda forward. And as David said, as a D&I representative in a firm, that change it's taken so much pace over the last 18 months, which is a real positive to see. And firms need to keep up with that, be part of that change.
So no pressure there, David. It is now got some real motivation and some momentum behind it. Are there other trends or wider issues that you see being championed? So perhaps just looking at across the whole pandemic that we've experienced, what would you say are the biggest trends that we're seeing across the ESG or the EDI agenda that are being most championed? Dionne?
I think that social, if we're talking about ESG, is leading in a big way, and I think that's for obvious reasons. People are the pulse of any company, and I think there is a growing demand for organisations to be more socially responsible. People are assessing companies' cultures, their values, the impact they have on society before they decide whether they want to work there or whether they want to engage with them full stop. And I think that trend is only set to grow as people become more and more socially and environmentally conscious. And, you know, the world is evolving and we have to evolve with it. Again, companies, they have an obligation to drive change. And I think ESG actually offers an opportunity to really assess how we're doing things and how we're operating and really kind of lift the bonnet on the business and start looking at how these things are affecting our people as well as our planet and the next generation.
And of course, we're also seeing demands from clients as well, really piling on the pressure. Social value is a massive issue for us at the moment, isn't it? And rightly so. David?
Yeah, I would echo what you said, Charlotte and Dionne, about social value. It really is rising up, but it fascinates me that it has so many dimensions, because it kind of covers, depending who you speak to, diversity and inclusion, well-being, mental health, social mobility. You know, there's a whole raft of stuff, isn't there? And it's an emerging agenda. So we're all playing kind of, we're all trying to catch up, aren't we, and stay abreast of it, which is where the contact between us and other colleagues in external firms and organizations becomes really helpful. And I think, as you mentioned, Charlotte, there is actually a great commercial opportunity here for diversity and inclusion to step out of the HR prison or wherever it is that D&I sits within your organisation. It can sometimes be a bit trapped kind of in there as a kind of cost centre that doesn't offer the business much value. Whereas actually, when we start contributing to bids and winning work, then suddenly we become important and worth listening to. I think in terms of the trends that are emerging, for me personally, I think the black equality, race equality, very much kicked off by the murder of George Floyd, has really risen up the agenda. And that's not just in my firm, but across everyone I've spoken to, it's become a focal point. I think there is a renewed focus on gender. And I wonder, Charlotte, whether that's partly spurred by some of those stats you highlighted around the differential impact of the pandemic on women and the added pressure they are under. They're now reviewing, where did we get to on gender? Why have we been working on it for decades and it feels like we're not getting anywhere? And basically just a kind of more questions asked at the senior level about what are we doing, what's going on, why are we not seeing change, or why is the pace of change so slow?
Thank you. Nicky?
Yeah, I agree with all of those points. And I think it's interesting that more and more clients are asking firms for their D&I stats, which, you know, when it starts to hurt partners' pockets is when partners start to listen as well and drive new agendas and change, which is interesting, isn't it? And I think lots of firms are looking to recruitment agencies such as Ambition to say, how are you attracting candidates in a different manner? It's not just the same way to attract the same kind of candidates. And, you know, I sit on a board, sixth form board for a school in Camden, and we really do look at how we can drive change for students. And, you know, I work with a lot of young people to talk about how what their journeys are going to look like over the next few years. And, you know, if you look at where we are at the moment with the pools of candidates that we have, it's by working with young people that we will make the bigger impact. And in fact, younger people coming through have got such a really advanced way of thinking about what they want and the kind of firms that they want to work for. And if firms don't change, they are not going to be able to attract the talent of the future.
Absolutely. And we know it's how hard it is to find people. Just going to wrap up with our final question before we go to Q&A. Taking the idea of sort of themes that we just talked about, what other taboos do you think we are yet to break and that we should embrace from a topic perspective? David?
Thanks, Charlotte. I think it's a really cool question, because even mentioning the word taboo is a bit taboo, isn't it, in the context of D&I? And, you know, we mentioned difficult conversations, awkward conversations, challenging conversations, courageous conversations. Well, there's nothing more courageous than addressing a taboo head on, is there? And I know for some of us, it's speaking up about race or equality in a mixed group when perhaps if we're white. Do we feel the courage to do that? Do we feel entitled to raise an issue and not want to speak over the top of the people and for the people that we're trying to be allies for. I, in my own personal experience, have a bit of I've experienced taboo in a sense that because I identify as bi, within the LGBT plus community, to some degree, I don't exist. And I think I kind of threaten the stability of say, the gay male identity, because I get the feedback, well, you're not really bi, are you? You're actually gay, but you just haven't made your mind up, or you're too scared to say you are. I think for me, the biggest taboo that I don't see being addressed much or talked about is why the word love is taboo in the workplace. Why do we not talk about love? What does loving leadership look like? What does it mean to love your team and your people so much that you want to create for them an environment where they feel like they belong? And so we trivialize love into, well, it's not appropriate to talk about that in the workplace because it's unprofessional, and I don't want to know what you do in the bedroom, reducing love down to just one tiny subset of what it is. But that whole piece around how we can be ourselves and the authenticity that we discussed earlier. And just to share, you need to know these stats, right? I'm going to share a couple of stats that are really important, because for me, love is the strongest path to belonging. If you create an environment where someone feels loved, they're going to feel like they belong in your firm and they're going to want to stay. And there's proof of this. Where there is a strong sense of belonging in the workplace, there's a 56% increase in job performance. There's a 50% reduction in turnover risk. And there's a 75% reduction in employee sick days. Now, the holy grail of getting more discretionary effort from our people, reducing the amount of sick days, the amount of turnover, and increasing their contribution to the firm, these are things that people who count money and pay attention to finances are very interested in. And yet we're not having that conversation with them, I don't think, in a powerful way that we could. And say, you know what? If you just made people feel like they belonged in this firm, here are the results you're going to get from that labour. So that's I think that's a taboo that we need to tackle head on.
Oh, that's incredibly powerful, David. Thank you. Nicky.
I think there's going to be a huge uprising in people with mental health issues over the coming months and years. In fact, I think the amount of pressure that people have been under through work, home life, and illnesses, and not being able to see family members, and not being able to take breaks, and it's just this pressure pot that has grown and grown and grown. And I think that's something that firms are going to have to be able to address and come up with some better ways of supporting their staff and employees. And I think it's interesting to me that even in my company over the last 18 months, sick leave has been minimal. And yes, of course, some of that is because people aren't going and travelling on public transport and carrying germs around. But I think people are scared, worried, nervous about having time off, because everything is people being so present, being on a Zoom call or a Teams call, or making a comment in a Teams chat. And so I think there's got to be a lot more support from firms to say it's okay to take a break. And it's absolutely essential that you take a break. And also, there are going to be times when you do need to just take a little bit of time out. There are a number of firms that are doing mental health days as well, so that employees can take, whether it's a day a quarter, which is just for their own health and well-being. And it's not classed as a holiday, but it's either go for a walk for the day, take your dog out, sit and watch Netflix all day, just a way of being able to rebuild your mental health in a positive manner. But I think there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do over the coming years.
Absolutely, Nicky. Thank you. And Dionne.
Well, I think the line between professional and personal is almost going to dissolve, because I think humanness is going to take centre stage. Some of the things that David mentioned on having a loving environment in the workplace, and the point about mental health that Nicky's raised, it shows that these are all of things that just wasn't invited to be spoken about in the workplace. And I think what the pandemic proved is just how valuable people are, and the fact that you do have to put your people first. And the businesses, they've reaped rewards in the process. Like Nicky said, you've hardly got any sick days, and I know it is the same for within my team. So I don't think we need to kind of prove the concept of putting people first any further. But what is important is that we aligned EDI and to the values and strategy of the business, because I think that will be the difference between successfully building an inclusive workforce and being stuck in time.
Thank you. Absolutely. There's so many things that we can do. So just to sort of wrap up what we were talking about before we sort of go to Q&A, the pandemic has been good and bad. It has brought some fantastic changes. Some people feeling they're able to be more authentically themselves, more conversations starting, more obvious issues relating to latent and overt inequalities between different groups of colleagues and individuals. And a huge opportunity now we're back in the office or going back into the office to start to put even more of our good intentions into action and to really see a new way of working and a new office environment, a new professional services environment where anybody can be authentically themselves, they can talk about the issues that are important to them, and that this is continuing to further the quality of the interactions between people and to improve the opportunities for everybody, so people can actually, from all sorts of underrepresented backgrounds, are able to progress in their careers and have fulfilling and satisfying professional environment. Thank you very much to our panel. I'd like to go to the questions now, if I may. I've had a couple of questions through. So the first one is, what effect do you think that diversity inclusion has on the employer brand, either internally or both internally and externally?
I'm trying to remember the stat, and sorry to bombard you with statistics, but I think it was something like 3 out of 4 candidates take the diversity and inclusion of their prospective employees into account when considering where to go to work. Anecdotally, I know this to be true. I know it's also a reason why people leave firms, to reinforce, I think, what both Nicky and Dionne have said earlier. And I think it's crucially important because, reputational brand has so many different elements, doesn't it? It's got the sort of hard, concrete things you can measure, but it's also got that instinct, that feeling. And I suspect, and this could be me just getting too obsessed about this point, but I think when you go to a recruitment fair and you have a candidate come up to you and ask a question about your organisation and working there, they might say, what's your trans inclusion policies like? Will I feel welcome? Are there role models who look like me in senior roles? I actually think all of the questions they're asking are just one question. Will I feel loved? Will I feel I belong? And they're expressing it through different lenses, but that's ultimately what they want to know. And that's really what the brand is there to communicate, is when you come and work for us, you belong here. Maybe that's a bit simplistic. The marketing department will freak out if they hear me reduce it down to something so simplistic. But personally, if I were running the brand department, as it were, or the marketing department and so on, and wanting to connect with people, I'd really want to emphasize the importance of belonging, the importance that you feel loved, and that involves communicating authentically where you're at and where you're not yet at.
And being brave. That's a brave conversation to have. Nicky or Dionne?
Yeah, can I just pick up on that point as well, that, as I mentioned earlier, it is a candidate market, and candidates care about how they feel, as to David's point. So they want to look at role models, they want to see behaviour is actually being followed through by the partnership groups and also the other groups that they can be part of. So if that is not reality, and people talk, there's forums, there's so much information that's passed around now about what's happening through social media, that it very quickly gets into the market if there's great diversity policy, but the inclusion piece isn't followed. So you really do have to live and breathe what you're saying you're doing as a firm. Otherwise, 1, you won't be able to attract your talent, and 2, you'll lose talent.
No, yeah, I completely agree with everything. And Nicky, I was actually going to mention that I think that it's really easy for people to see through policies and see through, website pages. They want to see the reality. Like you said, yes, you're interested in D&I, but is that actually represented in your workforce? Is that represented in your values? And I think that there is a high risk that if you position yourself as an organisation who cares about D&I and cares about their people, and you do not match that then that will be completely problematic for you.
I'm going to move on to the next question now, which is that I read that KPMG are encouraging their people to use internal reporting procedures to flag unacceptable behaviour rather than going to the press. What do the panel think? Do the panel think that there will be a change of attitude towards whistleblowers in the workplace as these issues become more important to their reputation? So I think really are whistleblowers then less likely to be seen as troublemakers? Perhaps it's what I'm reading there. I don't know if you agree with me. And actually people who are helping the organisation to further itself as these issues become more important to an organisation's reputation.
Yeah, I don't mind starting with this one. I completely agree. I think that companies want to hear if there's bad practices going on. And I think that, again, this is one of the positives of the pandemic, that people are more open to talking about issues or problems that they're not happy with. I'm not saying we've achieved some nirvana around information flow and we've got where we need to be, but I think people will speak out. And I think what happens often is that people speak out in exit interviews. So again, once you see the number of people leaving, there's normally some kind of issue that then needs to be addressed. So what firms need to do is make a really open format for people to communicate so that things can stop and be halted before it gets to that stage.
Thank you. Dionne, David, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Nicky's saying. I think that the reality is if companies are really serious about D&I and they want to know where there are bad practices, then they are going to have to champion that. And again, that might be as simple as just being open, as we've spoken about on this call so far, so that people, again, feel as though there aren't going to be these massive repercussions for them, rightly so, bringing up the things that are impacting themselves or others. But there is, there does need to be a piece that communicates that, a piece that addresses that, so that everyone understands that actually if you do practice in this way, if you do make what we'd say offensive comments, knowing that actually we have set ourselves as a business who doesn't allow that you have to expect that there will be repercussions for that. And regardless of if it comes from a whistleblower or whether it directly comes from someone who's experienced that, the means doesn't matter. It's just unacceptable.
For me, I immediately think of the importance of psychological safety in organisations. Even if whistleblowing mechanisms are anonymous, I think we know from statistics that people are still reluctant to make use of them. Clearly, things have got too far and too out of hand by the time you need to get whistleblowing happening, because obviously the behaviour has happened that shouldn't have ever happened in the first place. And so if we can find a way to address I think the other thing is it's quite a blunt instrument, isn't it? And we know from feedback that some people want to address inappropriate behaviour, but they want it resolved at an informal level early on. What they don't want to sign up for is to have a process taken out of their hands where they then become powerless and uninvolved in it, and they don't know what's going on, and it's now a runaway thing and highly formalised. And in some cases, that's appropriate. It needs to be tackled as this is a major disciplinary issue, and it's whistleblowing, and your conduct is unethical as well. But let's dig behind that and say, where did that fire start? We're now using a fire extinguisher, but can we stop people lighting those fires in the first place when they put a match to something and start burning our organisations down? And that's where what I call the say-do gap comes in. This is when leaders in organisations in particular say, well, of course, diversity and inclusion is important to us. Of course, ethical behaviour is important. It's our number one priority. And then what do they do about it? Either very little, or perhaps they act actively against inclusion and diversity. So it has to be consistent, led from the top, with leaders who say what they mean and then do and act in a way that's consistent with that.
I suppose actually just picking up on some of the points that you've made, all of you, which is this idea of psychological safety, but actually do we always need to go down that kind of an internal route? How comfortable is the person who is perhaps subject to some unacceptable behaviour, in terms of how comfortable are they to address the issue directly back to that person. But equally, what about allyship? What about people who are onlookers, witnesses, also calling, stepping up and saying, hey, that's not on, and providing support to the person who was the victim, but the subject of the negative behaviour. I think there's a long way to go on that, and actually people having that sense that they are allied and they will be supported by their colleagues as well, which would reduce the number or the requirement to go down in more formal routes where perhaps it's not entirely necessary. The next question. Many companies are now doing diversity and inclusion training for partners and other areas of their organisation. It strikes me that this isn't going to drive quick change. What's the one thing that we as individuals could do right now to improve diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity? David?
I would say have the courage to approach someone who is different from you with the intention of learning from them, and learning perhaps to stand in their shoes, learning to understand what they experience in the workplace. Listen to them, learn from them, and then lead. No matter what level in the organisation you are, even as a junior person, you have a leadership role when it comes to D&I.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to have the right people at the table, and making sure that actually you have a voice and you should use that voice regardless of what level. The reality is we all should be aiming to reflect the communities that we live in and the communities that we serve. And I think trying to draw in different people across the organisation to really get to the heart of some of the issues that surround EDI will help companies to understand how their people are being affected, therefore how their business is being affected.
And reverse mentoring, I think, is really important as well, which I know some firms do really well. So really get some of the partnership group who maybe haven't experienced, as David and Dionne said, by talking and liaising with people that have gone through experiences so they can better understand.
Thank you very much. Excellent answers. Thank you. And I think this is our final question. So do you think disability or impairment is a barrier now in professional services? I don't have a registered disability, but I feel I've been discriminated against numerous times in the workplace, but unable to take action. I was once told by a legal recruiter that I would never work in the city. I went on to prove that recruiter wrong, but I do feel that my career has been stifled as a result of my impairment. So is it a barrier now? Is that changing?
I'd like to think it was changing. I think there's so many different forms of disability or impairment, and it's quite shocking, isn't it, to hear that somebody had such direct discrimination of being told that they would never be able to work in the city. And hopefully that wouldn't happen now, and hopefully the change is marching forward. But as David said, I think earlier on in the start of the conversation, if you are hard of hearing, or if there's some kind of impairment and people are wearing masks, or it is through not face-to-face contact, that can actually create a disability break in itself. And it's how do we make sure that we're more inclusive to stop that happening?
Absolutely.
This reminds me that no matter what we do as organisations to drive things forward, the individual experience of people can be suboptimal. I know that Business Disability Forum and Purple Space, as two examples, are doing lots of great work to drive things forward, but I wouldn't think we could put our hands on our hearts and say we're there yet, could we?